All right, welcome everyone. My name is Stephen Norris and I am the Walter Havighurst Professor of History and the Director of the Havighurst Center for East European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at Miami University. Before I begin, I also want to particularly thank Len Stevens, the Havighurst Center's program coordinator who's here, and Jade Schramm, our wonderful undergraduate assistant here who's done much. Both of them have done a lot to help bring Andrey Kurkov to campus. I was waiting for applause, but you know. The Havighurst Lecture is the signature event of the Havighurst Center. Since our founding in 2000, the Havighurst Lecturers have included 5 heads of state. I include Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, the Belarusian opposition leader, who delivered the 2022-2023 lecture. Among them, 2 prime ministers and 2 Nobel Peace Prize recipients, including the most recent lecturer, Alexander Matvichuk, who spoke this past May. Today's lecture will be the 3rd one delivered by a prominent writer, following Herta Müller and Georgy Gospodinov. It's an honor to introduce Andrey Kurkov, this year's lecturer, and to welcome him back to Oxford, Ohio. He visited in February 2008, in a very cold, snowy day, I think then, to introduce a film based on one of his novels, A Matter of Death and Life. He returns today as an even more prominent writer, and most importantly, as one of the most prominent speakers about Ukraine at war. His novels and nonfiction works, and he just gave me a count here, he's written 26 novels, 10 children's books, and 5 nonfiction books. These works have been bestsellers in Ukraine and abroad, and have been translated into more than 45 languages. Recently, his novel Grey Bees won a translation prize in France and received the first ever book and translation prize from the National Book Critics Circle here in the United States. Boris Doralyuk, who translated that work into English, also serves as the translator for Kurkov's ongoing historical mystery series set in revolutionary-era Kyiv. The Silver Bone appeared, the first in this series appeared in 2024. The Stolen Heart, the second in the series, came out earlier this year. And The Lost Soldiers will be published in May, all with HarperCollins publishers. A multilingual Ukrainian, Kurkov has emerged as an eloquent spokesperson for Ukraine and for Ukrainian freedom. His ongoing diary series, 3 volumes of which have been published in English, Diary of an Invasion, Our Daily War, and just recently 3 Years on Fire, document his experiences since the February 2022 full-scale invasion of his home country and testify to his bravery as well as to that of his fellow citizens. He's a regular commentary and essayist, as well as the subject of features in newspapers and TV stations around the world, including the New York Times, the Atlantic Monthly, and the Guardian in England. Taken together, his fiction and nonfiction illustrate the vital role that culture plays in Ukraine and during this war. Andrey is going to speak for about 30 minutes. I'll ask him a couple questions to get a conversation started, then we'll turn things over to you all, open the floor for questions, and we'll end at 5:45. Please join me though in welcoming Andrey Kurkov.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited, more excited than jet-lagged to be here for the second time in my life, to see first snow this year falling from up there, and to talk about Ukraine because this is the most important topic for me and for most of Ukrainians. They don't want, and we don't want Ukraine to be forgotten, and it's very easy to forget a war which is going on without end and without breaks from 2014. You remember that the war started with the annexation of Crimea in February 2014, and then the war in Donbass. And then for 8-9 years we had a very strange, quiet war with dead and wounded, but with the world actually not talking about this. Everybody thought that the war is over. But I will probably start not from the war, but from something more different to me. First of all, my background. I'm ethnic Russian, born in Leningrad, grew up in Kyiv. My grandmother lived in Kyiv always, and my family moved to Kyiv when I was 2 years old. So actually I'm 62 years of my life. I lived in Kyiv, and my main language is Russian. I learned Ukrainian in the school. I worked as an editor in the Ukrainian State Publishing House in the Soviet times. And I write in 3 languages. I write fiction in Russian, non-fiction in Russian, English, and Ukrainian, and books for children in Ukrainian. It's just, to mention, because later I will be talking about linguistic situation in Ukraine, and this is a always hot issue, Ukrainian-Russian languages. You know that Russian is now considered language of the enemy. 40% of Ukrainians spoke Russian before the war. Half of these Russian speakers became refugees because the war came first to Russian-speaking areas in the south of Ukraine, in Donbass. But again, I will jump now deeper in the history, because it's very important to understand the background of this war and the hate of Putin against Ukrainians. He is not the first one to hate Ukrainians. But why? The main thing which is overlooked very often is the difference between Russian and Ukrainian mentalities. Russia was always empire, monarchy. Russians always loved their tsars, and when they didn't love a tsar, they would kill him and love the next one. But I mean, when you live in the monarchy and you are a loyal subject, you are usually politically passive, you accept or expect presents from the Tsar, and you live quietly, trying not to attract much attention. Ukrainians are the opposite. Ukrainians never had royal family. On Ukrainian territory there were small kingdoms in the Middle Ages. They didn't exist for a long time, but generally, I mean, Ukraine, which is mentally as it is mentally presented today, actually was formed in 17th century, when on the maps in Europe, the huge territory between Russian Empire and Poland and other countries in the west was called Cossacks' land. I mean, there were different names on the maps. I recently went to a very nice museum in Romania, museums of maps, and I took photos of 40 different maps from the Middle Ages, and like every second or third map would give different name to this territory, because, I mean, Ukrainians very often, especially patriotic amateurs of history, they say it was a proper state, Cossack state. Well, it was and it was not, because it was ruled by, the territory was ruled by Cossacks from the 17th century. They were choosing their leaders. The leaders were called hetmans, headmen. So, I mean, there was some kind of election. But every time a leader who was supposed to be a leader for the army, Cossacks army, but was the head of the territory, once he was elected, the other Cossacks would try to replace him with somebody else. So Ukraine was formed as an anarchy / democracy. And Ukrainian Cossacks and Ukrainians since then were used that they can change the politics, they can change the direction the territory is going. At the same time, in Cossacks Ukraine, there was a military justice system. There were military courts. There was a diplomatic institution, because in the archives of Istanbul you can find correspondence between Ottomans and Ukrainian hetmans. But there was no Ukrainian currency, because Ukrainians, like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, were relying on Polish silver, Russian silver, Turkish gold, etc. And so also the territory, I mean, the borders were never fixed, because all the borders were front lines. Ukrainians were fighting for more than 100 years against Poles and against Russians. And the most famous battle, actually, on the Eastern Front took place in 1659. It was a Konotop battle in which Cossacks defeated Russian army. You will not find the battle in the history books in Russian. And it was not actually mentioned in the Soviet history books. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian historians started digging out forgotten or banned secrets, including the tragedies like the artificial famine of 1932-33, the deportations of Ukrainian farmers in 1928-29, etc. But what I forgot to mention, a very important word for Ukrainians: individualism. Ukrainians were never collective. They were individualists. Each one wanted to create his own paradise on his piece of land inside his house, and it was almost impossible to unite Ukrainians. And this mentality actually was suppressed in the Soviet time, but what is very important to remember that Lenin never trusted Ukrainians and never visited Kyiv, because he obviously understood that with Ukrainians you cannot build a communist society because of this individualism. And to crash this individualism, the Russian language was used. Because what is national identity? It's language plus culture plus history. So for Ukrainians, actually Ukrainian language meant also the connection with the land, the connection with the history, the connection with culture. People's songs in Ukrainian, etc. Actually starting from 1720, Russia was trying to replace Ukrainian language in Ukraine with Russian language, because they realized that imperial language means that you change people's identity into imperial identity. So if a Ukrainian starts speaking Russian, then Russian culture becomes his culture, Russian history becomes his culture, and he becomes a loyal subject to the monarchy. And that happened many times. The same happened in the Soviet Union. After 1929, the Soviet authorities restarted old Tsarist campaign to Russify, to introduce Russian language in Ukraine, and the 70 years of Russification actually resulted in probably 80% of Ukrainian territory to be Russian-speaking, to become Russian-speaking in the cities. The countryside actually kept Ukrainian language, and that gave probably the reason for many people in Russia to say that Ukrainian language is peasants' dialect of Russian language. Well, I will not go deeper, although it's very easy to go deeper, but the fact that Ukrainian peasants didn't want to join collective farms is actually a proof of Ukrainian individualism, because they were very good individualist farmers. And for that, the best farmers, about 150,000, with their families were deported to Siberia. And they survived there, and they became there loyal Soviet citizens. And now they are loyal Russian citizens. In Ukraine, actually also to crash this individualism, the Golodomor was organized. It was 1932, when there was a hunger in Volga region in Russia and in Ukraine. Well, in Ukraine, I would say less serious hunger than in Russia, in Volga region. But the Soviet authorities sent Russian or Soviet army to take all the stocks of grain, of food from the Ukrainian peasants, not from the cities, but from the peasants. And it was taken to Volga region, and then we had between 3 and 4 million people dead because of hunger, and lots of cases of cannibalism. Horrible things which were never mentioned in the Soviet time, but recently I came across a case, actually, a file of the Soviet secret police and KGB, where a woman was accused of eating neighbor's child. And this was something which happened many times. But now back to 18th century. 1709 is probably the favorite moment of Putin, because he loves Russian history, especially when Russia is expanding. In 1709, the most famous battle between the Ukrainian army and Russian army happened. It's called Poltava battle, and there is a poem by Pushkin, Poltava. There is also a poem by Byron, and there are lots of other poems dedicated to Mazepa, Hetman Mazepa, Ukrainian Hetman Mazepa, and to Poltava. It was part of Northern War between Sweden and Russia. Maybe you know that actually Leningrad, St. Petersburg, was built on the territory taken over from Sweden. So this is actually a part of this process. And in this war, Ukrainian army, together with Swedish army of Karl XII, was defeated. And Ukrainian Hetman Mazepa and some others escaped to Bessarabia, which is today Moldova and Odessa region. And that was the end of Ukrainian independence. In Russia, since then, actually, Mazepa means a traitor, because they thought they bought Mazepa, they gave him lots of land in Russia. He was one of the richest aristocrats in Russia and in Ukraine, but still he decided to switch sides and to fight on Ukrainian side. Although, I mean, one can say that he was supporting Sweden, but I mean, Swedish army was not really strong, and most of the soldiers were Ukrainian Cossacks, and it was an attempt to return Ukraine to the free status which Ukraine enjoyed before 1654. 1654 is the moment when Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky sent a letter to Russian Tsar asking him for military help against Poland. So the Russian army helped to fight against Poland and refused to leave Ukrainian territory. I will be just looking not to miss anything important. Yes, and 11 years after Poltava battle in 1720, Peter the Great signs the first decree banning Ukrainian language, actually banning publication of religious texts in Ukrainian language, and also ordering to remove all existing texts from Ukrainian churches. Between 1720 and 1917, there were more than 40 decrees by different tsars limiting or banning practically Ukrainian national identity. Mostly language, theater in Ukrainian language. Catherine the Great banned education in Ukrainian language, and one of the oldest Ukrainian universities, Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, was to change the language of lectures into Russian. So, I mean, you can see that we are talking about 3 centuries of attempts to assimilate Ukrainians, to turn them into Russian loyal subjects. And we have the repeat today. On the occupied territories, there are no more Ukrainian schools. Education is done in Russian, but what is interesting, you can learn Ukrainian according to the manuals published during the war in Russia, texts in Ukrainian about love to Russia, about beautiful Moscow, and about great Russian culture. I mean, I think the tradition, Russian tradition, never changed. But just a second. Yeah. But on 24th of February 2022, when the full-scale invasion started, suddenly about 200,000 Ukrainian men who worked abroad rushed to Ukraine to defend Ukrainian independence. At the same time, actually, thousands and tens of thousands of Ukrainians were running to western border from all around Ukraine, away from the war. And I was driving on the 25th of February with my wife in the direction of Lviv to find our 3 children and their friends and to take them to the western Ukraine. And we had traffic jams, 50 miles long, 70 miles long, because we have only, I mean, a huge country, size of France, has only one road from the center to the western border. And this road sometimes has 2 lanes in one direction, sometimes has only one. So you can imagine actually in this bottleneck, the whole of Ukraine was trying to get through. And I remember the first stop we had to make, 15 kilometers from Kyiv, next to Bucha and Gostomel, at the moment when there was battle for Bucha and battle for Gostomel. And we were stuck in this traffic jam. On the right there was a car with Dnipro, with another city in the southeast number plate, with a family with 2 kids and a young driver who was sleeping at the wheel, because actually obviously he was driving already for 20-30 hours. And it took us 22 hours to, I mean, not to get to Lviv, but to get 70 kilometers away from Lviv, because the road was just impossible. In the end, actually, we managed to to find our kids. And what I was shocked by, and I took a photo, and I still have it, when we entered Lviv and we were passing through the center, there is a hunting weapon shop there. It was still closed because it was 9 o'clock and it was supposed to be open at 10. But there was a queue of young people in front of it, obviously thinking to buy hunting arms just for self-defense or to go to the front line. And actually, this is the main difference between Russians and Ukrainians. And I'm not talking about ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians, because we have several millions of ethnic Russians in Ukraine who are political Ukrainians, as well as Putin loves to repeat quotation from Peter the Great, that Russian is everybody who loves and supports Russian Empire and helps to expand it. Yeah. So Ukraine is a multicultural country with one state language and with probably 20-25 minority languages. And all these Ukrainians who rushed to the front line, they went there because in Ukraine, for Ukrainians, freedom is more important than stability. Losing Ukraine was actually meaning losing freedom. For Russians, because of this monarchic tradition of obedience, stability is more important than freedom. That's why in 23, 24 years, which Putin was ruling the country, Russians, bit by bit, rejected their freedoms. I mean, they had freedoms at the times of Yeltsin, and then slowly they lost them, and they didn't. I mean, there was a protest on Bolotna Square, but it was not Maidan. And this is actually also the difference, because when Ukrainians are unhappy, they go out to the streets and they organize Maidan protests. That's why in Ukraine, politicians are afraid of civil society. In Russia, civil society, which doesn't exist anymore, was afraid of police, and the system was organized in such a way that for any kind of contradiction or protest against the Russian system, first you get fined, then actually you can get into prison, but first actually fine, and then you are called a foreign agent, and then you go to prison, or you are allowed to emigrate and to become a member of so-called Russian opposition in Europe or in America. So I think this probably was one of the messages I wanted to share. And now I'd like to give you some kind of background of today's Ukraine, because the news and statistics probably you know from the media, but the consequences of this war are not really discussed, because now life is very different and every Ukrainian is very different now, mentally, psychologically, emotionally, than he or she was before 2022. Because I remember that once actually we were woken up with my wife at 5 o'clock in the morning by the explosions outside the windows, and when I accepted that this is something much bigger than one could expect, I lost attachment to the material world. And to explain it, I need to mention that I was always, as a child, a collector. I had a huge collection of stamps, coins, old books, records, vinyls, and I have also in my collection 8 gramophones. And suddenly everything stopped being important, because you cannot take this when you are on the run. And when we were leaving Kiev, actually, we didn't know with my wife whether we returned or not. She took a Bible. That was the only book in the car. I didn't take anything. I didn't take anything from my archives. I had taken my computer, of course, yes, but we left everything behind. We became displaced people, displaced persons in Uzhhorod on the border with Slovakia. We spent there 4 months. And I was actually reporting from there for the CNN, for other radio and TV about what was going on. Our friends became displaced persons in Berigova, in Chernovtsi, all around Western Ukraine and South Ukraine. So, I mean, the demographical change started happening, and people who were trying to get abroad, and until today, actually, you cannot go abroad if you are a man, a male, between 18 and 60. So, the refugees were the women with children and older people. Recently, young men were allowed to leave the country if they were under 23 years old, but for another reason. But now, after that happened, and actually yes, and after Uzhhorod, I was invited to France for 2 months, and I became, with my wife, we became refugees there. And it was, well, for a writer, it was very interesting experience, but I met lots of refugees who were so unhappy that in the end, actually, they preferred to return to their bombed out villages and towns in still controlled by Ukrainian armed forces, part of Donbass. And one story I still remember, because I met 7 women who left, actually, well, I mean, 5 of them left together from Drushkivka, from town in Donbass, which is still not occupied but bombed every day, with 4 cats in a very old car. And they made it to Italy, where the car broke down and it was impossible to repair it. And then a French guy took pity on them, and he towed with his car them to France and left them in Montpellier. And the mayor of Montpellier allowed them, or not allowed, organized tents for the refugees inside the sports hall of one college. And that's where we met with them. And of course, I mean, they spoke only Russian. They understood Ukrainian. They didn't speak any French. They didn't know what was happening. They were given food, some money. And then, and I kept in touch with them. And they were given a flat, a big flat, in a village, in French village, 40 kilometers from Montpellier in the south, beautiful area. And they just got, I would say, almost crazy there, because without French language you cannot exist in France. So, I mean, they were going to the supermarket showing fingers, but I mean, it was very unpleasant. And they were welcomed by the villagers, but they couldn't stand it. And then they stopped answering my messages, and I assume they returned to Ukraine, as actually many who returned from the countries with a difficult language. Like many people were welcomed in Romania, but they didn't want or couldn't learn Romanian, and for the same reason they either tried to go to Germany or to Poland, or to return. And the reason why, for example, Poland has 1,200,000 Ukrainian refugees, because it's very easy for Ukrainians to learn Polish language, because they are similar in a way, although phonetically they are different, but grammatically and vocabulary is similar. So when you are reading, or somebody tells you that Ukrainians think this, or Ukrainians think that, just remember that we don't have one Ukraine now. We have 5 Ukraines, and they have different opinion. Because I'm talking about 7 million refugees, Ukrainian refugees abroad, 4.5 up to 5 million of displaced persons living in other regions of Ukraine, regions with different traditions, sometimes different language, sometimes different culture. We are talking about Ukrainians who still live at home, and this is a majority. It's maybe 15, 20 million people. We are talking about 1 million in the army, and we are talking about probably about 3 million of people who remained in the occupied territories. And when some Ukrainians are saying that those who remained on occupied territories, they are pro-Russians, it is not true, because they are just afraid of going, of becoming a refugee, because people, especially older people, they prefer to, as they say, to die at home than not know where they will die and what will happen to them. And this is actually was the reason why I wrote the novel Grey Bees, about grey zone between, in 2017, between the separatists and Russian positions and between positions of Ukrainian army, because in 2015 I traveled with probably the most famous Ukrainian poet Serhiy Zhadan along the front line, and we were trying to talk to locals. We organized discussions, but we also had events for the Ukrainian army. And then actually when I talked to locals in Donbass, I understood, I mean, Donbass never traveled. And Donbass was the most collective region of Ukraine, because it was still Soviet after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a hierarchy. I mean, it was run after 1991, not by the Communist Party, by the local oligarchs, who were exploiting people, who were telling them for whom to vote, and who were controlling actual life of the society. So when we had already tens of thousands private entrepreneurs in central Ukraine and western Ukraine, Donbass was still proud of their huge mines, huge industries, huge factories, etc. And when I talked to people who then actually remained in occupation after 2022, but I talked to them before when it was still controlled by Ukrainian army, they were telling me that they are afraid to go anywhere. Because here they have relatives buried in the local cemetery, they have memory, they have their house, they have their beehives and gardens, and to leave it and to go somewhere, for them it was unimaginable. One thing which is also interesting, that the cultural life of Ukraine stopped overnight on 24th of February 2022. All the bookshops closed, publishing houses closed, theaters, and for 2 months practically there was no culture in the country, and writers and actors and all important cultural figures who lived in Kiev, they moved to Lviv. And suddenly Lviv became a capital of culture without culture, because actually you could see all these people in the cafes, but you couldn't see what they were doing because theaters didn't work. But once Ukrainian army managed to liberate Kiev region, when the Russians were thrown out from Bucha, Gostomel, from Chernobyl zone, there was an euphoria, there was sudden optimism that this war will be over soon, and the cultural life immediately was restored, and the writers and journalists and actors returned to Kiev. But the most incredible thing was that practically on the front line, one of the biggest cities of Ukraine in the east, Kharkiv, restarted its cultural life in bomb shelters and inside metros. So actually, I mentioned Serhiy Zhadan. It was his initiative to start literary discussions, philosophical discussions, book discussions on the platforms of metro stations. And metro in the Soviet Union was built as a bomb shelter in case of the nuclear war. In Kiev, sometimes it takes longer to get down to the platform than to ride on the train for 5 stations. So then we had also in Kiev concerts on the platforms and even film screenings. So I mean, we had several months of underground, really underground cultural life, and then cultural life restarted on the surface when the Russian army was moved out from Kharkiv region, from part of Kherson region, and from Kiev region. And there was some kind of even, I would say, resurrection, more than resurrection. I mean, it was risorgimento of culture, because suddenly everybody started saying that there are more books than before. It's impossible to buy theater tickets, which is still the case actually. If you want to go to a theater, you have to buy tickets several months in advance now. But it was true that suddenly in 1 year, in 23, we had 13 new bookshops in Kiev. And the biggest bookshop in Kiev on the main street, Kreshchatyk, was opened by Alexei Yerinchak, a person who already owns several small bookshops, in the premises which were used by Zara and by brands, fashionable foreign brands before. Well, the secret is, I would say, there are two answers to this, why it became possible. First of all, a lot of educated Ukrainians decided to support Ukrainian culture, to buy books, to buy paintings, to buy whatever they could produced by the actors and by the artists in order to support Ukrainian culture, because suddenly they understood that actually culture is a victim. And this message came thanks to Russians who started destroying by missiles Ukrainian museums, churches, libraries and theaters. And the most famous tragedy is actually a Russian aviation bomb that was dropped on Mariupol theater, with people hiding. Locals were hiding inside, and we don't know the number of dead people. But today, Russia restored this theater, and they are going to reopen it. And you know, there is so-called on the Red Square, almost on the Red Square, there is a beautiful cathedral, like Disney-style cathedral, which is called Savior on the Blood Cathedral. So, I mean, the Mariupol theater can be called theater on the blood, because actually you don't know whether the remains of people were completely removed from the rubble or not. And of course, the other reason for these new bookshops was that in the wartime, the commercial rent is going down. Ukraine was abandoned by lots of international brands, so lots of premises became available, and the owners wanted any kind of money, and so, I mean, the cheap rent helped to rent this, to open new bookshops. It will be gone once the war is over, but now, I mean, there is some kind of feeling that the culture is became big now. I mean, it is big, but at the same time, I mean, there is a huge problem with literature, because, I mean, everybody now writes about war. Very few novels are written, and that's why now 80% of the books which are popular are translations of foreign best-selling novels. Because Ukrainians, in these 4 years, they got tired of reading about the war when the war is around them. And also, I mean, you should understand that every big city doesn't sleep already for 13, 14 months, because every night there are sirens and explosions everywhere. In Kiev also. So every week we have in Kiev between 5 and 10 people, sometimes 40 dead because of the missiles and drones, and sometimes 40, sometimes 80 wounded. And what happens to psyche, to human psyche, when you live in this situation? You start ignoring the alerts. I mean, typically people check on the telegram on the mobile phone the reason for the alert, but everyone knows what it is. It is actually 400 or 500 big Iranian drones which carry between 50 and 90 kilos of explosives, and Russian missiles. And actually, as I speak, Kiev is without electricity. Now we don't have electricity for between 12 and 18 hours per day, because all the electrical stations around Kiev, and not only around Kiev, are destroyed already by Russian missiles. Ukraine lost in this war more than 260 writers, translators and poets. So, I mean, there will be a huge void in Ukrainian literature. And this is a repeat of another tragedy. In 1937, more than 300 best Ukrainian writers and poets were killed in Gulag on the order of Stalin. And they were killed to celebrate the 20th anniversary of October Revolution. They were killed on the 3rd of November. The anniversary is on the 7th of November. And after that, Ukrainian literature became flat. It became like propaganda. So, I mean, the writers were writing only correct, politically correct communist literature. Those who were not writing, or were writing something about Ukraine, but not about Soviet Ukraine, they were punished. And the last poet, Ukrainian poet, to die in prison was Vasil Stus from Donetsk, who died actually in 1985 when Gorbachev was already General Secretary of the Communist Party. So Ukrainians have a lot of bad memories from the Soviet period. And after this war, I mean, there will be no good memories about Russia at all, because I mean, you can imagine that we don't know the exact number of Ukrainians killed in the war. We know that more than 600 children were killed by missiles and drones. And probably about 150, 200,000 or more Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian military. But the total number is not known. And of course, I mean, like when Mariupol was bombed, the whole high-rises with flats were erased together with the inhabitants. So, I mean, it's unimaginable. In the last 4 years, Ukrainians went through different phases of emotional state because of the war. When Kyiv region was liberated and Kharkiv region was liberated, Ukrainians were euphoric and very optimistic, thinking that actually we can liberate other regions and stop the war. I mean, it was a naive thought, but what was incredible that these regions were liberated without Western military aid. At that time, actually, no aid was coming. Germany sent 5,000 helmets, not helmets, the casks. Helmets. Yeah, helmets, yeah. This was Olaf Scholz present. He didn't want to discuss anything else. So Ukrainians thought that if we can liberate our territories using actually still Soviet and post-Soviet ammunition and weapon, then it is good. And Ukraine was preparing for big counter-offensive in 2023, when we started receiving already Western ammunition and Western weapon. And it didn't work. So in 2023, Ukrainians just moved from euphoria to despair. And today, one can say that the situation in the minds of Ukrainians stabilized. So Ukrainians became realists. They understand that this war is for a long time. It will go on definitely until death of Putin, and maybe longer. Why? Because this is Putin's last war. And he started it not only to expand, to restore Russian Empire, but also to be remembered in Russian history as one of the most efficient tsars. And that's why actually he refers very often to Peter the Great. Because, I mean, I remember when first time Putin quoted Peter the Great, I was surprised because Peter the Great was quite open to Europe. He learned how to build ships in Amsterdam. He invited German doctors to move to Petersburg, etc. But of course Putin loves him because he defeated Ukrainian army together with Swedish army in Poltava. And for him, nothing matters now. Neither Russian economy, which is going down, nor the human losses of Russian soldiers, nor the future actually of Russian reputation and reputation of Russian culture. Because actually he destroyed not only reputation of Russian classical culture, but he created some kind of immunity against everything Russian in Ukraine, in Poland, and in many countries. I mean, one can discuss whether Tchaikovsky is guilty or not, but many musicians, well, all musicians in Ukraine and many musicians in Europe refused to play Tchaikovsky. Although, I mean, his main sponsor was actually a German family, Demek, from Ukraine, who built railways in Ukraine. Well, I mean, Ukrainian history is incredible and interesting, and I would be happy to suggest you to read some of the books which are available in English. One of them, very easy to read, is by Sergei Plokhy, Professor Plokhy from Toronto University. It's called Gates of Europe, or Gate of Europe. Gates? I think Gate of Europe, yeah. But also it's important to read Red Famine by an Apple boy, Timothy Snyder. And please read war non-fiction by young soldiers who are writers, who were professional writers, like Alexander Mikhet, The Language of War, Artem Chapai. And I think this will help you to understand what is happening in Ukraine. What will happen actually after Putin's death? It's a good question, but in Russia, always after death of somebody who stays too long, there is a war between different groups who want to take control. And the most logical, I think, outcome of his death would be the small civil Kremlin war between four groups. One group is very important because if they win, the war will be over. It's Russian oligarchs who suffered from the sanctions, but who suffered also from Putin and his KGB friends. And three other groups are connected with military and secret services. It's the army elite, the elite of political secret service FSB, and military secret service GRU. So if they win, one of them, the war will go on probably because they don't have anything in the West, and they want to keep. I mean, what they are afraid of course, if the economy doesn't collapse, they are afraid now of these hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers who were paid to kill Ukrainians, who will come back, and they are used to be paid huge money for the war. They will never get even 20% of this money, whatever job they find. So, I mean, this is the danger which awaits Russia. But the oligarchs should be very unhappy because in the beginning of the war, Putin forced them to move their money from foreign banks, including Cyprus, to Russia. And now there is an agreement with China that Russia will take a huge credit in Chinese currency, in yuan. And this is a very interesting financial operation. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I'm trying to analyze it as a writer who sometimes is a journalist. So what will happen that probably Putin will force oligarchs to buy these yuans, the Chinese currency, and they will have to keep it waiting for the currency to be bought back by the state, which probably will never happen. And the rubles from the oligarchs will be used for the military economy, and in this way, actually, Russia will control the inflation. Well, I don't know. Miracles happen. And you know that after each death of General Secretary of the Communist Party, on Soviet televisions, there was always Swan's Lake by Tchaikovsky, a ballet. So, I mean, I don't like ballet, but if it is shown, I will record it. Yes. Well, thank you very much, and now probably we'll just...
Thank you so much, Andrey, for your perspectives. Maybe I'll ask just a couple questions, and then we'll open the floor for anyone to ask questions. I think one thing that most people who know you think about first when they think of you is your wit and humor. And you wrote in your diary of an Invasion, that February 2022, you felt as though you had lost your humor and you may never recover it again. And at the same time, you wrote that you didn't think it was possible for you and maybe anyone to write fiction anymore. So it's a two-part question. Have you recovered your humor? And if so, why? What led you to recover it? And have you been able to write fiction again? And if so, why?
Well, in the beginning of the war, and probably for the first 5-6 months, the humor in Ukraine was supported by the soldiers from the front line. They were recording funny videos, and posting them on Facebook, and they were keeping the morale of the society, because was it conscious or subconscious action, I don't know, but I mean, that was something that surprised me and that helped me to get back to my sense of humor. And actually 6 months later, there was already no humor coming from the front lines. The prose, I mean, prose writing is very important for me, and I did suffer for 2.5 years. I was not able to write fiction. I had a novel which I started before the full-scale invasion. I had 70 pages already, and then I tried to restore the work, to restart the work later several times, and I failed because writing fiction is a pleasure, and it's very difficult to justify having pleasure in the times of the war, especially when you have only bad news from the media. And the second thing is that to write a novel, you have to detach yourself from the reality for several hours a day, because otherwise you cannot actually check the news and at the same time write something fictional. This was another reason why I couldn't write fiction, because I couldn't detach myself, distract myself from the reality, from the war. I was all the time in touch with my friends in different parts of Ukraine to see what is happening. It was only in July 24 that I managed to get back to this third novel about Samson, this historical crime novel, the third one in the series, and I finished it in November, and I thought I would start immediately the next one. I wrote one chapter and stopped again. But now I think I can write fiction because I got used to the war, as many. I mean, it's a horrible thing to say, but I got used to the news about dead and wounded every day. We lost some friends with my wife. Our friends lost their sons in the war, and when you have this daily horrible news, you don't have emotions anymore. I mean, like you are exhausted, you just take it, you understand it, and you don't show emotions. And then you accept, well, I mean, you understand that you can function in the country at war if you accept that you can be killed tomorrow. And I think actually Ukrainians who remain in Ukraine, who didn't become refugees, most of them, they accepted the possibility of dying because of the drones or missiles. And actually once you accept it, the life becomes normal. So you enjoy every day of your life. And in the beginning of the war, when actually Kyiv region was liberated, lots of people returned to Kyiv and immediately started going to restaurants more often than before. For two reasons. Because they understood that it doesn't make doesn't make sense to save money anymore, so they were taking money from the banks, from their saving accounts, to spend them while they are alive. And because actually they liked to be part of this social life, sudden social life, which was obviously in contradiction with the real situation, with the danger. And I mean, it's a bit different now, the atmosphere. I mean, still people go to restaurants, to bars, but now the restaurants are closed, and because they cannot employ waiters, because, I mean, lots of people, men, were mobilized, and now the young people were allowed to go abroad if they are under the age of 23. And that happened, from my personal point of view, because there were protests of young people recently against an attempt by Zelensky's administration to take under control anti-corruption institutions. So, I mean, this is a story which is still going on, but the protesters were all young, and many actually young men between 17 and 22. So, I mean, this is my explanation of this strange and, I would say, I'm not sure, a very good decision, but at the moment actually more than 100,000 of young men, mostly 22 years old, 20 years old, left the country. And also, I think that up to 80% of the refugees will not come back from abroad. And also 500,000 of Ukrainian kids are attending schools now abroad, which means that they are already integrated. They are studying maths and history in German, in Polish, in Czech, and their mothers will not want to take them back to the country at war. And also, many families are broken because of this, because the husbands are on the front line or they cannot leave the country, so the wives are filing for divorce online. And this is a topic which is not discussed enough in Ukraine.
It's a very downer way to end a question about whether or not your humor was restored. But you did mention this book series you're writing, the fiction series, about set in revolutionary era Kiev, the 1919 to the early 1920s. It's a wonderful series, the third volume of which will come out in English in May. So my last question to you, and then we'll open to the floor, is what led you to the past? Like, how did you start this series, and what is it about the revolutionary era in Kiev that interested you, and what does it help us understand about this history you gave to us earlier?
Well, I mean, I was fascinated by history when I was 18 years old, 17 years old, because in 1980, I was 19, my grandfather died, and he was a Stalinist. He was a school director in Rostov-on-Don. He was a Don Cossack, so my father's family comes from Don Cossacks. And only after his death, actually, my father told me that grandfather had two brothers who were imprisoned, who were communists in the 1930s in the north of Russia, and they were both imprisoned and sent to Gulag. And I don't know what happened to one of them, but another one, after serving in the camp and then fighting, he settled in Siberia. And at this moment, actually, I realized that I learned the falsified history of the Soviet Union in the school, and I decided to try to find out what really was happening. And I started traveling in the Soviet Union by hitchhiking with a huge dictation machine, and I was looking for VIP pensioners who were occupying important positions in the old times. And I was a student in pedagogical college, but I was pretending to be a student of journalism. So I was saying that I want to interview you, I'm studying journalism. And I recorded many conversations with these people. And then I realized that actually it doesn't make sense to talk to these VIP pensioners, because they were happy. Because actually, I mean, they had special pensions. They were telling me how happy they were in 1930s, 40s, 50s, etc. But I found the pensioners who were not happy, and who were also important in the Stalin's time, and then they were dismissed after the Khrushchev's era, or in Khrushchev's era. And they were bitter, and they were telling much more interesting things. Yeah. And I used some of the conversations in my 5 novels about evolution of Soviet utopian mentality from 1917 till 1974. Yeah. And of course, I mean, in 2017, when I finished The Grey Bees, I got a phone call in Kyiv from one lady who was and is my reader, and she said she has a present for me. So she came, I gave her my address, she came with a box full of authentic files of Bolshevik secret police concerning 1919 till 1921 in Kyiv. The real cases, the fake cases, lots of handwritten documents written by the detained people who were accused of crimes they either committed or not. But what was the most incredible, that in order to show that they are not guilty, they were describing their days on which they apparently committed something. And from these descriptions, I imagined life in Kyiv during the Civil War. And this was partially life very similar to today's situation. No electricity, although, I mean, it was very criminal situation then, and in Ukraine it's less criminal because it's a separate story about crime and war. And I mean, because of these files, I decided to write a series of crime novels. But I want to say that this war, 1917-1921, was and is described in Russia as civil war. I mean, it was civil war in Russia, not in Ukraine. In Ukraine, it was 2 civil wars and 1, more or less, international war. Because in Russia, Red Army was fighting against White Army. So Tsarist army of Kolchak, Denikin, was fighting against Bolsheviks. In Ukraine, Ukraine announced its independence in 1918. German army stayed in Ukraine after the end of the First World War. And Germans supported Ukrainian independence and supported the last chosen hetman, Pavlo Skoropadsky, who had his own army. And there was another Ukrainian army of Simon Petlura, Ukrainian politician, essayist and poet, who wanted to build different kind of independent Ukraine. So he was fighting against Skoropadsky's army. This is war number 1, Ukrainian civil war. Russian civil war was happening on Ukrainian territory because we also had Red Army and White Army. But we also had the biggest army of anarchists in the world, set up by Nestor Makhno in Poltava region, famous Poltava region, in 1918, first with 35,000 soldiers and then up to 80. And Makhno was first for independence of Ukraine, and then he sided with Bolsheviks. And then his army was destroyed by Red Army. And the biggest puzzle for me in this history is Polish army. Because what we know is that Kiev was occupied by Polish army in 1921. But there are no novels about it. There are no, I couldn't find non-fiction or historical books about Polish army in Ukraine at that period. In 1921, the Red Army came to Kiev for the 4th time, took it over from Polish army, and then all of Ukraine was taken over by Red Army, by Bolsheviks, and Ukraine was announced Soviet Republic and became part of the Soviet Union. Apart from Western Ukraine, which at that time remained part of Poland and part of Romania. So, I mean, you can see how fascinating is Ukrainian history. And Kiev history, as a part of Ukrainian history, is not less fascinating because today we can say that Kiev is one society, one community. At that time, in 1919, and probably until 27, 26, each district of Kiev had different political orientation. So the top town was liberal and populated by mostly Russian speakers, aristocrats, educated people, clergy. Podil, a Jewish crafts district, was a commercial part and part of transportation system because the port on Dnieper River was situated there. The district Kurenivka, which is part of ordinary Kiev today, was a village inside the city with peasants, and peasants like ideology and priorities. And when in April 1919 there was like bandits rebellion, so the anarchists and bandits tried to take over Kiev from Bolsheviks. So the Kurenyovka people supported them, and Podil people fought against them. And in the end, actually, they were crushed. I mean, these rebels and bandits. I mean, they were criminals. And what is another, I mean, one of many interesting things is that at that time, in Kiev, there was a very powerful Polish mafia. And in the files of ČK, this Bolshevik secret police, there are lots of documents written in Polish, but also many documents written in Yiddish. And on the first Soviet like IDs of that time, every line, I mean, like the word name, is written in 5, 6, or 7 languages. So it shows actually how multicultural Kiev was.
So I'll act as Andrei's PR spokesman here and say, if you haven't read these mysteries yet, the central conceit, the main character, Samson, in the very first page, in the very first scene, has his ear cut off by a Cossack sword, and then he later finds that his ear will still hear for him. So he goes to work for one of the secret polices and can leave his ear to listen in on the conversations and solve crime. This is typical Andrey Kurkov mentality here. We have time for a couple questions from the audience, so please, if you want to ask Andrey Kurkov something, go ahead. Naya.
Hi, Mr. Kurkov. Thank you so much for coming to Oxford. I hope you've had the most wonderful time amongst the Renaissance here. You mentioned Zelensky. I was just wondering, what are the different ways that Ukrainians are sort of perceiving, I guess, his administration, especially because normally people turn against their leader once a war continues, but this situation seems a little bit more nuanced because of this acknowledgement of Putin's tyrannical rule in Russia.
Well, Zelensky became president in 2019. He was a comedian with a different sense of humor than one I appreciate. He's not a politician and he didn't have any vision. He brought to power lots of film people, television people, producers. He also did what other politicians did before. Ukraine is the motherland of anarchy and of individualism. The best proof of it is the presence of more than 400 political parties which are registered in the Ministry of Justice. Most of them are dormant. They exist only on paper, but they exist. And actually, if you want to go for local elections, you have a choice of either register your new political party and wait 1 year, or you can buy existing dormant party very cheaply. And this party will resurrect itself, and there will be a general meeting, and the owner of the party will pass his leader's role to you. So actually, the party, servant of the people of Zelensky, was a party which had another name, and then it was bought, and then the future members of parliament were enrolled online. So anybody, and that made also Zelensky popular. So anybody who wanted to become member of parliament had to send online forms, fill their forms online about their work, CV, biography, which meant that actually nobody was checking them, because later they were among the new members of the parliament, there were ex-criminals found and some other dishonest people. And anyway, I mean, this was something very new for Ukrainians, but the campaign of Zelensky on TV and everywhere else was based on the shaming all the previous, and especially the previous president Poroshenko. So Poroshenko's reputation was destroyed on the same TV channel that helped to elect Zelensky, because the owner of the TV channel was a personal enemy of Poroshenko. So now actually 25% of Poroshenko's voters are the enemies of Zelensky. They criticize him all the time. He did waste 3 years before the full-scale invasion by promising a peace deal with Putin, which never came to be. And all I would say, he became a statesman only after the beginning of full-scale invasion. He is still the most popular politician in Ukraine, but Ukrainians change their views very quickly. I mean, it's very dynamic society. So I think once the war is over, there will be change of sympathies. But now, I mean, we cannot have elections in the wartime because of the 5 different Ukraines which cannot vote together. Because can you imagine organizing, voting for 7 million refugees abroad? So actually, any elections which are organized in the wartime will be later announced illegitimate by any sort of high court. But once we have elections, Practically, Zelensky, the only competitor could be General Zaluzhny, the ex-head of the army, who is the Ukrainian ambassador in the UK. I'm not sure it is I mean, he's an honest guy, obviously, and he has a very good reputation, no scandals connected with him. But as a military, he wouldn't have a political team to go with him, so he can be used by existing politicians, or he will invite people to power who have no political experience. This is also possible. So it is, I would say, a difficult situation. Yeah. But I didn't vote for Zelensky, and I don't think I will. But I appreciate everything he did in the wartime and he's doing now.
Our last Havighurst lecturer, Alexandra Matvichuk, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for founding the Center for Civil Liberties, was asked a similar question in May, and she said it was her right as a Ukrainian and an example of Ukrainian civil society to criticize her president. So she criticized Zelensky for roughly similar reasons. Maybe one more question for the crowd.
So you mentioned Ukraine as like an individualistic nation. Is that a new idea, or is that how it's been historically? And individualism is the foundation or synonymous with liberalism. So do you believe that to be the primary cultural driver separating Ukraine and Russia?
Well, if you give me 5 more minutes, I will explain. Yeah, I mean, historically, Ukrainians are individualists. The individualism on the Soviet-controlled land was crushed by force, by famine, by deportations, and they became Soviet collective people. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine was at that moment divided, and the border was not between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, but between the collective mentality territories and individualist mentality territories. So, I mean, individualism was still very strong in the 3 regions of Western Ukraine, which became part of the Soviet Union only de facto after 1945. You remember Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. So, I mean, these territories, plus Bukovina, which used to be part of Romania, they kept this individualism. And once the Soviet Union collapsed, the individualism, this mentality, Ukrainian mentality, started pushing Soviet mentality back in the direction of Russia. And this border between mentalities was moving east. And if we didn't have this war, in 30 years' time, in 40 years' time, the border between mentalities would finally coincide with the border between Russia and Ukraine. But it would take a lot of effort, and I should say that we never had professional politicians who were real statesmen, who could explain their vision of future of Ukraine. I mean, young Ukraine was pro-European in the beginning of 2000. Old Ukraine, older generations, were still nostalgic about Soviet life, but they were pro-Soviet, not pro-Russian. And Russia was using this nostalgia, and they created a satellite TV channel, which is called Nostalgia, which is, you can tune to it, which is broadcasting Soviet TV films, Soviet comedies, Soviet talk shows to support this nostalgia. So, I mean, the Russian secret services are very clever and very efficient, and once maybe you will be surprised how they were involved in many things happening in the US, as they were involved in Brexit in Great Britain, and they are involved in the independentist movement in Scotland, etc. So, I mean, but it's a separate issue, very interesting issue, yes. So, this individualism is back because it is a genetical thing. Because when you don't have a royal family in the country or on the territory, you have more freedom automatically, you have more voice, you can speak louder, and you can express yourself. And Ukrainians are not afraid of expressing their opinions, even if, I mean, they love to disagree. And actually sometimes I think that they elect somebody in order to hate him, to keep him as a guilty side, responsible for everything which is going wrong. So this can happen also to Mr. Zelensky after the war.
I'm reminded you once wrote that there are about 40 million Ukrainians, which means that there are about 40 million different visions of what Ukraine's future should look like. And that's both a blessing and a curse. So let me say two things in closing. First, in the guise of your agent, which is just to tell everyone here that Andrey Kurkov will be at Lane Public Library in Oxford tomorrow at 6:30. The bookshelf from Madeira, Ohio will bring books to sell. We don't have a bookstore here in Oxford, Ohio anymore, but they will bring some books to sell, and Mr. Kurkov will happily sign them there if you wanted to come out tomorrow night as well. The second is in my guise as Havighurst Center Director, and that's just to say that every single person Andrey mentioned for you to read has either been here or will be here in the spring. Sergei Ploki will be here in the spring, and we're going to do a book club with Chapia. His new book, Normal People Shouldn't Carry Grenades. He's going to join us via Zoom from the front lines of the war he's fighting. So do pay attention to Havighurst Center events in the spring, but first let's give Andrey Kurkov a round.
Thank you very much, and just read Ukrainian writers and all international writers. Translated literature is great. Don't concentrate only on American literature, which is also great.